we've already seen methods by which the government can influence the behaviour of market agents where the market fails to produce a socially optimal outcome. And we've seen they can use taxes and subsidies. We've seen they can institute private property rights as ways of trying to influence the behaviour of agents in the market. But there's one more way in which the government can try and control the behaviour of agents, and that is directly. That is to pass laws which stipulate what firms and consumers can and can't do. So when we talk about direct control, and this can be either legislative or statutory, we're talking about direct control over the behaviour of private agents. Now this is going to be especially used by governments in situations where the externalities could be very large, such as, for example, regulating the behaviour of firms which supply the service of transporting nuclear waste. So this is a highly regulated kind of behaviour. The government doesn't use taxes and subsidies to try and control the transport of nuclear waste or anything like that. It directly stipulates the behaviour. Alternatively, it might be the case that the government would utilise direct control over agents if it believes that there's a high probability that the agents will not act rationally, in which case the government would step in and simply dictate how agents will behave. Thus, we don't leave it to agents to hopefully act in their own interests in response to instituted property rights or taxes or subsidies. In the case of positive externalities, a direct control that can be utilised is a quantity floor. That is, a lower limit on the quantity of a good that must be legally exchanged. And let's say we'll set it at Q star being the socially optimal quantity. For example, there's quantity floors placed on basic education, motorbike helmets, vaccinations, where there's a minimum quantity that has to be purchased by participants in the market. Well, they're compelled to participate in the market effectively. In the case of negative externalities, there can be, and therefore in the case of negative externalities, there will tend to be overproduction and over-allocation of resources to the market. There can be a quantity ceiling imposed by the government. That is, an upper limit to the quantity of a good that can be legally exchanged, again set at the optimum level. So, for example, sometimes you'll see there'll be a fishing quota imposed on a fishing industry, or a quota on the number of trees that can be cut down by the forestry industry. Graphically, we can represent the idea of a quota in the following way. Here we've got the marginal social benefit and the marginal cost, and there are negative externalities of production which, if taken account of, would shift the supply curve up to the marginal social cost curve. But if those are not taken into account, the government could calculate what those externalities are, calculate what the theoretical marginal social cost curve is, then determine what the optimal, socially optimal quantity should be. That is, the interaction of the marginal social benefit curve and the marginal social cost curve. The point at which they interact, or they intersect, gives us the socially optimal quantity. And the government would then simply impose a production quota. It says no more than 300,000 tonnes per year, might be say fish, is allowed to be acquired. So this would be the efficient equilibrium, the socially efficient or the allocatively efficient equilibrium quantity. Now, in that case, we can see that the marginal social benefit, the value at this quantity of 300, the value placed on that quantity by the consumers and society is greater than the marginal private cost to the producers, that is, to the fisher folk. So there's a profit margin, there's a profit on this marginal catch, and we know that, assuming that the participants in the market are rational, they will have an incentive, private incentive, to keep increasing production, increasing the fish catch, up to the point where the marginal social benefit curve just equals the marginal private cost curve. That would be optimal for the private agents in the industry. So there is an incentive to overfish when the production quota is put in place. And indeed, assuming that that production quota is not enforced, is not policed, and people are not prosecuted for violating the quota, then there will indeed likely to be overfishing. So the imposition of production quota isn't simply a matter of passing the law and saying, there, the problem is solved. It also requires enforcement of that law, which will have additional administrative costs, large or small, depending on the nature of the industry and how difficult it is to police and to prosecute. Some examples of direct control we can find in Australia. In fact, there's quite a few direct control mechanisms utilised by the Australian government. For example, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999 gives the Commonwealth the authority to directly regulate air quality, water use, and access to biodiverse systems. There are other kinds of regulations that we already know about, which are kind of obvious to us in our everyday lives. Well, maybe not this one. Biohazard waste and the disposal of nuclear waste and its transportation is something which is directly controlled by government and is heavily regulated. Road rules are the classic example that everyone is aware of. Health and quarantine regulations and drug prohibitions are all examples where there is direct control over agents' behaviour. I should say, with respect to ill-formed or self-harming preferences, which I haven't dealt with anywhere else in terms of government regulations, we can see that the kinds of solutions that would be involved on the part of government vary depending on the nature of the problem with consumers' preferences. If it's a question of consumers simply not having sufficient information, then a government solution can obviously be the provision of information, either by the government itself, which would be funded through taxation, or through private organisations which would be subsidised by the government. For example, there's advertising about the harmful effects of smoking, information provided about fake weight loss schemes, and so on. But we can also think of Pigovian solutions to ill-formed or self-harming preferences. And taxes on cigarettes is, of course, the classic example. The imposition of a tax on cigarettes, we know, is predominantly borne by the consumers of cigarettes, because we know that the price elasticity of demand for cigarettes is very low. Demand for cigarettes is relatively price inelastic. So any imposition of tax, a sales tax on sellers, is ultimately mostly passed on to the consumers in the form of higher prices. And if those taxes are large enough, and therefore the increases in price are sufficiently large, it will ultimately eat into, so to speak, the quantity demanded of that product and will discourage people from purchasing cigarettes, and people will presumably, either through an income effect or through substitution, they'll start to look for alternatives. There'll be a decrease in the quantity demanded. Also, there can be subsidies for education, so that people are encouraged to engage in education because they're given some money to do so. And of course, there is, as we've already talked about, direct action. So this is where ill-formed preferences or self-harming preferences are simply not allowed to manifest themselves in the market because the government simply prohibits the expression of those preferences. So you could have a prohibition on the cigarette market, for example, just as there's a prohibition on, say, all sorts of other illicit drugs. You could also have a minimum quota for the consumption of motorbike helmets for people who ride motorbikes, of course, not just people walking around in the street. Although I suppose you could have a law which says that everyone must walk around with motorbike helmets on their head in the event that they accidentally fall down, so they won't get brain damage by hitting their heads on the cement or something like that.